We've sentenced Disney villains and Pixar villains, so what would be better to do now than the villains from the best place for cartoons? That's right, we're looking at the villains of the Cartoon Network shows, but not just any random series. We'll be starting from the very beginning and sentencing the biggest villains from their most iconic 90s cartoons. With villains ranging from mad scientists to supervillains to bullies, which ones will get off easy and which ones will only be wishing they were so lucky. I'm Caleb with Wicked Binge, and this is Sentencing 90s Cartoon Network Villains for Their Crimes. First on the stand today are the villains of Cartoon Network's first original animated series, Dexter's Laboratory. Starting us off is an individual who puts the mad scientist, Mandark. The only notable recurring antagonist in the series, Mandark is also one of the evilest. He's obsessed with proving he's more intelligent and superior to Dexter, and he's committed a fair share of crimes in his many attempts. In his very first appearance, after proving he had a bigger laboratory, he ordered Dexter to either shut down his lab or become his assistant. This immediately makes him guilty of blackmail. His run-ins with Dexter have very nearly caused him to commit assault and very nearly murder. He's also responsible for lots of property damage throughout the show. In one episode of the series, both he and Dexter took control of statues of presidents and pitted them against each other, causing massive damage. Mandark is a very cunning foe, and we haven't even gotten into the events of the Ego Trip movie yet. Throughout the film, he stole many of Dexter's ideas and inventions before finally becoming the ruler of Earth. While all of this was eventually changed and never came to be, it still shows that for Mandark, nothing is off limits in his mission to gain power. When we consider all of his crimes and the severity of them, we think it's best if Mandark receives 25 years in prison. Some would argue that the events of Ego Trip should earn him a far harsher sentence, but since they didn't technically happen, we'll let him off a little easy there. But even ignoring those crimes, Mandark is a villain who will do anything if he thinks it can help back up his case that he is indeed the smartest scientist in the world. As bad as prison can be, we believe Mandark would agree with us that there are far worse fates. An evening with his parents, for instance. While Dexter's Lab doesn't really have any recurring foes outside of Mandark, it does feature a character who gets in Dexter's way almost as much as Mandark does, or perhaps even more. That person is Dexter himself. Yes, although Dexter is the main character of the show, he's just as many times the villain of the series. So many times throughout the show do his creations cause havoc, forcing himself to clean up after his own mess. Take the Godzilla-esque Dexter, for instance. He was awakened by Dexter and went on to create chaos throughout Japan. Not only was he guilty of property damage for this instance, but the injuries and possible deaths inflicted during this rampage would also be on Dexter's hands. Even beyond accidental mishaps, Dexter has been personally behind several crimes in pursuit of proving his genius. When he used his giant robot to battle kids in Japan, this didn't just awaken Dexter. He also caused damage to the environment that was all of his creation. For all of this, we sentenced Dexter to 5 years in prison. Some of you may argue that Dexter needs a far worse sentence considering the severity of his crimes, but we'll argue in Dexter's favor. Dexter has saved humanity on several occasions, and not always from something of his gone bad. He saved us all from a future where Mandark ruled. Besides that, when you look at both of them, Dexter is very clearly not a villain like Mandark is. While both are obsessed with proving their intellect, Dexter has a clear conscience and a sense sense of morality, both of which Mandark lack. While he's far from the most straight-laced scientist, this boy genius has a better moral system than Mandark, and it's that humanity found in his character that saves him from a sentence more similar to his rivals. Second up is Cartoon Network's biggest hit of the 90s, the Powerpuff Girls. The first villain we'll be looking at is the monstrous monkey himself, Mojo Jojo. When it comes to evildoers, few have done as much as Mojo here. He's turned people into puppies, led an army of monkeys, formed a parody of the Beatles, the works. Throughout all these attempts to rule the world, one thing he's known for is making a mess of the city of Townsville. He's destroyed everything from buildings to cars, making him guilty of property damage. Beyond that, he's known as the most famous member of the Powerpuff Girls Rogues Gallery. He's tried again and again to destroy them, adding 3 different counts of attempted murder to his sentence. And since all of them are children, we'll also go ahead and add child endangerment to his growing list of charges. Lastly, Mojo Jojo's many attempts to take over both Townsville and the world make him not only a perpetrator of property damage, but also terrorism as well. He wants nothing more than to rule everything and everyone, and he'll do anything to make sure that goal becomes a reality. Nobody is safe from this primate's wrath. An extremely dangerous villain, even if a bit silly, we have decided to give Mojo Jojo our first life sentence of the video. Mojo Jojo poses a threat to not just the Powerpuff Girls and not just the city of Townsville, but the entire world. For the safety of humanity, it's probably best if this monkey spends the rest of his days behind bars. While Mojo Jojo might be the Powerpuff Girls' most famous villain, there exists another who most would consider their most evil. That being is, of course, him. A supernatural being who might just be the devil. Him has all of Mojo Jojo's aspirations, but practically none of the drawbacks. He can be silly at times, but he's a lot more threatening and serious than Mojo could ever hope to be. Like Mojo, he's motivated to destroy the Powerpuff Girls and rule the world, meaning he's just as guilty of terrorism and attempted murder as he is. During his frequent battles with the girls, he has also kidnapped them and tortured them, adding 2 additional charges to his sentence. All in all, as one of the scariest and most dastardly villains in both the Powerpuff Girls franchise and all of Cartoon Network, we think you'll agree when we give him our very first death sentence of the video. How that will be carried out, however, is anyone's guess. Him is an otherworldly demon, after all. Enter our next villain, Fuzzy Lumpkins. While him and Mojo Jojo were obsessed with power, Fuzzy is your typical small-time crook. He loves to steal and rob banks, giving him 2 criminal charges right off the bat. However, just like the 2 aforementioned villains, he is most definitely guilty of attempted murder, as he has tried multiple times throughout the show to dispose of those 3 bug-eyed freaks. However, his most infamous criminal charge undoubtedly came from the episode Impeach Fuzz, where he won the mayoral election and quickly turned Townsville into a pigsty of his own design. He ultimately left office after losing a wrestling match with the mayor, but his reign of terror remains a notable one. At the very least, it means we can add abuse of power to his already numerous charges. Overall, while Fuzzy Lumpkins can be a dangerous adversary on occasion, more often than not, he's closer to comic relief than a supervillain. As such, we have decided to give Fuzzy 30 years in the slammer. The combination of crimes such as attempted murder, abuse of power, and robbery will not be taken lightly by the courts, and they will likely seek out a long and tedious sentence for Lumpkins as punishment. Although his sentence is nowhere near as severe as the preceding 2 villains, Fuzzy's sentence will still be a rough one nonetheless. Should have stuck to life in the woods, Fuzzy. Rounding out the Powerpuff Girls villains is Princess Morbucks. A vain and cruel child who wanted to be the fourth Powerpuff Girl, Morbucks has become one of their most notable adversaries. Like all of the other villains, she has attempted murder and committed her fair share of vandalism. Interestingly enough, she is also like Fuzzy Lumpkins in that she is guilty of abusing power. Although we would argue Morbucks' abuse of power was far more egregious. In the episode Bought and Scold, she bought Townsville from the mayor and became his replacement. She soon legalized all crime and threatened the Powerpuff Girls with jail time if they attempted to stop any criminal activity. Because she's a child, it seems unlikely that she'd receive a sentence as harsh as the other villains, but after tampering with a government office, she'd definitely get a worse sentence than she could have got. We ultimately give Princess Morbucks 8 years in prison. While it's not as long of a sentence as some of the others have gotten, Morbucks will no doubt hate it all the same. But there does exist a silver lining here. With how rich her family appears to be, it'll only be a matter of time before they bail her out. It's time now for the third show we'll be covering today, Ed, Edd and Eddy. We're starting this section off with 3 in 1. Made up of Lee, Marie, and May, it's none other than the Canker Sisters. The Cankers are interested in one thing and one thing only, the Eds. They desperately want them to be their boyfriends, and they don't exactly have any idea what personal boundaries are. They are most definitely stalkers, and if you so much as dare to stand in their way, they'll make short work of you. They've attacked the other cul-de-sac kids many times, which means we can go ahead and add assault to the list of offenses. Their third and final notable criminal offense is vandalism, which they've done to many homes throughout the cul-de-sac. When we said they don't understand boundaries, we were not kidding. The Canker Sisters are unpleasant to deal with, but they aren't exactly a threat in the way other villains we've covered today are. What we think the Cankers need is a bout of house arrest. The Cankers can be a lot to deal with in the town of Peach Creek, but they are still young and naive. Some time stuck at home would keep both themselves and the rest of the cul-de-sac safe, at least for a time. And of course, that's assuming they follow orders and don't just leave to go after the Eds anyway. Whether or not this will actually work is up for debate, but in our eyes, it's the most sensible punishment given their offenses. We're not done with Peach Creek just yet. We've got one final character to cover, and that is Eddy's brother. Often mentioned in this series before finally appearing in the TV movie Ed, Edd and Eddy's Big Picture Show, Eddy's brother is a typical bully character. He has little issue bullying his younger brother, so much so that it borderlines on abuse. And when Double D attempts to speak out on Eddy's behalf during the climax of the movie, Eddy's brother assaults him, showing he has little regard for anyone who thinks he's weak. Guilty of abuse and assault, we give Eddy's brother 3 years in prison. There is the potential for him to get a harsher sentence, but considering his screen time in the series amounts to less than 10 minutes, it would be a bit of a hard argument to make. Still, Eddy's brother is far from being the ideal big brother, and maybe some jail time is just what this sibling needs to turn a new leaf. Get ready for a trip to the middle of nowhere as we discuss the villains of the last show we'll be covering today, Courage the Cowardly Dog. Up first is easily the most famous villain to emerge from the series, Katz. In most of his appearances, Katz focuses on creating new businesses with the sole purpose of luring in new victims. In his first appearance, a night at the Katz Motel, he attempted to feed Courage and his family to his spider pets. Not only does this mean he attempted to murder all of them, but it is also implied that he has indeed fed some victims to the spiders, making him one of the few individuals on this list so far to have murdered anyone. His attempts to take out Courage at a complete completely different criminal charge to his list, that being animal cruelty. Katz isn't just interested in murder, however, he also likes to torture his victims, making their fates all the more slow and painful. Lastly, Katz is guilty of impersonation via his many schemes involving the use and misuse of existing businesses. We're sure that Substandard Inc. wasn't happy to see him smear their reputation in an attempt to get eyes on his own cruise ship company. Overall, with all the crimes Katz has committed throughout the show, we think it's best if this kitty gets handed a life sentence. Katz is a cunning and charismatic villain who has more blood on his hands than anyone else on this list thus far, easily earning him a sentence of this severity. Some will argue that he deserves worse, but considering he's escaped even the belly of a shark, some time behind bars is probably for the best. Of course, that's assuming he doesn't wiggle his way out of that either. Second up is the most infamous foe. When you see him, you ought to slow. With rhymes like these, who else could it be other than Freaky Fred? A member of Muriel's family, Fred only appeared in one episode, but that one episode remains one of the most well-remembered in all of Courage. Freaky Fred is a barber who is obsessed with shaving the hair off both his clients and the unsuspecting until they are totally bald. He's done this to a pet hamster, a girlfriend, and even Courage himself. All of these instances could count as abuse, but in the case of someone like Fred, we cannot honestly see him serving any jail time for these offenses. Like his fate at the end of his only episode, Fred is likely to be committed to a mental institution. Fred isn't doing this to be evil or anything like that, but instead because he has the compulsion to do so. The courts would likely see things the same as we do and agree to find an institution that would serve his needs. An antagonist who is not really evil, Freaky Fred gets out of a lengthy prison sentence, but whether or not he'd get help for his obsession is questionable at best. Rounding out the entire video is a villain who is French, a con artist, and a duck all rolled into one package. It is Le Quack himself. Le Quack is motivated primarily by the pursuit of fortune, and he's willing to do anything to make a fast dime. In most of his appearances, he's pretending to be something he's obviously not, be it an amnesia specialist or a TV repairman. He's also routinely guilty of theft, repeatedly tricking and conning the bags into taking things and gifting them to him. While he's not one to get his hands dirty himself, he will trick characters like Eustace into getting rid of Courage for him, making him guilty of attempted murder too. Last but certainly not least, he's guilty of breaking and entering several times throughout the series, most notably breaking into Courage's house. A con artist who cares only about money, Le Quack has most definitely earned himself a hefty sentence of 15 years in the doghouse. He could have earned himself a worse sentence, but considering he only seems to focus on the Bag family, we deemed that as unnecessary. Speaking of them, however, it's also likely that Le Quack will not be allowed within a certain radius of their residence, likely ending his criminal spree once and for all. Unless he comes up with another con, that is. But let us know in the comments section if you agree with our choices, and tell us what we should cover next. Remember to hit that notification bell and binge more of our videos. But most importantly, stay wicked.